Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another Omnibus review and another horror-themed review as well, to continue on my recent run of videos where I've been taking a look at some of the horror-centric books in my collection. Previously this month I've already taken a look at the Tomb of Dracula Omnibus Volume 1, and previously the last video was actually the Marvel Horror Omnibus. So today, continuing in that same vein, I'm going to take a look at the Marvel Horror Lives Again Omnibus, which is kind of a sort of Volume 2 for the Marvel Horror book, but not exactly Volume 2 and not called Volume 2 because none of the stuff in here actually directly continues from the stories in that first one. It's just that it's another book in the exact same kind of style as the first Marvel Horror Omnibus, but featuring all new characters this time round, or all different characters perhaps I should say. So firstly then, this was the cover on dust jacket to the direct market variant, and this is a piece of John Romita Senior artwork. I think it was originally the cover to Giant Sized Chillers #1, which was the first appearance of Lilith, the daughter of Dracula. But the standard variant cover, which is underneath the dust jacket here, is also, in my opinion, an absolutely excellent piece of artwork, just beautiful stuff, by, I think it's pronounced In Hyuk Lee. And sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but this is just really nice. It was done specifically for this omnibus, as far as I'm aware, and features some of the characters in here. So front and centre you've got Satana, looking just stunning there. You've got Lilith, Blade, and Ulysses Bloodstone, I think it is, who's one of the characters that I'm just least familiar with in here. But yeah, anyway, so this is another great horror-themed anthology-style book. So we've taken a look at the cover, the dust jacket spine, very similar style to the first one. On the direct market variant, this one, you get this image of Satana there, down at the bottom on the dust jacket. I think it's something else on the standard variant, but can't remember what, to be honest. And then on the back, you know, kind of very similar kind of visual design and style to the first one again. So it is very much a companion to that book, really. And this time around, the characters involved, we're going to see Blade, Satana, Lilith, Ulysses Bloodstone, the Manphibian, John Kowalski, Hodiah Twist, and the Wendigo. And there's a whole host of stuff collected in here. You can take a look at that, pause if you're interested in breaking every issue down. But once again, I just point out there is an explicit content warning on here as well, just in the same way that the first one did. And that's really because, well, it's a horror book, so there's maybe some dark stuff in here, some mature things that isn't intended for all readers, but I think it's especially because of the fact that a lot of the stuff in here, as with the first Marvel horror book, is from magazine content rather than comic books, and so that typically tends to be black and white stories, black and white artwork, and feature more kind of, like I said, a bit more violence, a bit more graphic content, more sort of nudity, stuff like that, that wouldn't feature in a comic book from the time. So as a result, they slap that explicit content warning on the book. But whether or not it's too much for you or not, I suppose you might get an idea of when you look through this artwork in here. But for me, as with the first book, the stuff in here I think very tame really by modern standards, and not the sort of stuff that's going to really be particularly disturbing, I don't think, in most cases anyway. But yeah, so as with the first book, the kind of breakdown of the content, the style of the contents page is exactly the same, but obviously with the different characters. So firstly it tells you the creators who are working on the different stuff featuring each character. And then you move on to the next page where you get the actual contents. And as with that first book, it's broken down into chunks featuring different characters. So we've got Blade, Wendigo, Satana, and on you go. And again, just like that first book, not everybody's section, not each character's section is equal in terms of the quantity of content. So, you know, you're getting quite a bit of content for Satana, almost nothing for Hodiah Twist and the Manphibian. That Manphibian only gets one issue. Very obscure character. So yeah, so we take a look. So the first character is Blade. So first issue is Tomb of Dracula issue 10, which is also collected in the Tomb of Dracula omnibus. There is a little bit of double dipping with Tomb of Dracula in here, because you've got Blade, who came from that series, and you've also got Lilith, the daughter of Dracula, who appeared periodically in there. So there are a few issues of that in this book as well, because they feature her. And yeah, so really very much in the same style as the first Marvel horror book, as I say. If you liked that, or you're interested in that, then this is very much just more of that. So it's the same kind of 70s horror comics, well, mixture of comics and magazine content, as I've said. So this, for example, being one of the magazines in here, featuring Blade in this instance. Yeah, so it's very much that same style. So the magazine stuff tends to be, I think anyway, the better horror stories. Not necessarily the better stories, but certainly the more actual horror goes on in the magazine stuff, just because in those magazines they were able to get away with more things without as much censorship as they had to worry about for comics, which I think just allows them to be naturally, as a result of that, just, you know, more mature in the kind of themes and content they could deal with, which when you're looking at horror, I think can only really be a good thing. Yeah, so if this is a book where I haven't yet read all of it, so I've read through pretty much everything I think in the first book, maybe just a couple of things I haven't quite read yet. But in here I haven't quite got through to reading this one just yet. Not all of it, I've read bits of this book. But as I say, it's very much in the same style as the first Marvel horror book, so I feel certain that if you like that, you'd like this. And vice versa, you know, if you get this one first, you could go and read the other one if you can get a hold of that. But that's because this isn't a volume 2, you know, that's another thing. I think this one is still available. I think the first Marvel horror book is not. But if you were to buy this, it's not like you can't enjoy this because you don't have the first book. You know, as I say, it is not a volume 2. It's very much just like a 2-book set. But each of them contains their own totally separate stories and characters. Anyway, we're moving on to the Wendigo here. So the Wendigo, a character who, you know, and you see through this section, is just really featuring as a guest character in issues of the Hulk and the X-Men, because he's a character who, certainly through this time, was most strongly kind of linked to the Hulk and to Wolverine. And it's kind of interesting because in this particular book, just because of the Wendigo's involvement, you happen to get Incredible Hulk 181, and therefore the first appearance of Wolverine. Well, 180 when he first appears at the very end, and then issue 181 generally considered to be the first real appearance of the Wolverine, as he's called here, the Wolverine, in this kind of initial cat-like costume that he wore. I think that costume was designed by John Romita. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting because this is the only book in which I have, personally, Incredible Hulk issue 181 collected. And I think it's just a bit odd that out of every book it could be in, it's a Marvel horror book, which is not necessarily where you would expect to find that issue of all places. You'd expect maybe for it to be in a Hulk book or an X-Men book that I would have it in rather than this book, but there you go. Anyway, so there is also, you know, get here a Monsters Unleashed magazine featuring Wendigo, so yet again we're going black and white. And I really do like the black and white style when it comes to these horror comics. I think it really works for that style of story. But then we've got some of the Chris Claremont and John Byrne X-Men showing up in here as well, making always a pleasant appearance to see one of these issues. Never get tired of flicking through these John Byrne and Terry Austin issues and looking at the artwork. But again, it's featured in here because this was a 2-part story that featured the Wendigo as the primary antagonist, with appearance from some of Alpha Flight in here as well. So I've already covered this story twice, I think, on this channel previously, when I talked about the Alpha Flight Omnibus and the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus, in which these stories are collected. So yeah, I'm not really going to cover those again, but needless to say, great issues from an X-Men point of view anyway. This, you know, as I say, it's an anthology book, so it's very much like a compilation of all sorts of just completely different stories from all over the place. You're reading random comics featuring different characters. I think the characters who feature in the magazines most prominently are the ones that tend to be more interesting to read in these books. So like the zombie in the first one, and Gabriel the Demon Hunter, that's another good one. Then in this one you've got Satana here, starting with this. This is a really cool introduction to this character, in my opinion. Just a really short story by Roy Thomas and John Romita. So it's mainly just a few pages of John Romita pencils for the most part. Very short, but really cool. Nice introduction to her. And you get, you know, then the subsequent appearances of her in some comics and magazines, as is the style of this book. But yeah, so great artwork in here as well. So I've read these stories featuring Satana. These ones just caught my interest. These were good fun. The Haunt of Horror. Yeah, interesting. Some of the bits in here are almost like little novellas. So like you see in here, more like illustrated novels than either comics or magazines as such. I think this is by Chris Claremont, actually, unless I'm mistaking that. But yeah, so you get quite an interesting variety of content and storytelling styles. But basically Satana, she's the daughter of Satan, if the name wasn't enough of a clue to figure that out. So she's very much, you know, her stories kind of focus on sort of demons and dark magic, that sort of stuff. Get more of that kind of illustrated novel style here. This is another big book as well in terms of page count, slightly smaller than the first Marvel horror book, but overall very similar. They're both very big books, hefty tomes, hefty, spooky, horrifying tomes. Great stuff to read at this time of year, really. Halloween season. Bit of classic horror. So Satana here, you know, she wasn't just appearing in the magazines, as I say, so there's a Marvel premiere issue here featuring her. Can't remember if it's this story or something else collected after it, but I'm sure there's an issue where she appears with Doctor Strange and even Spider-Man. Cool cover. That's the one that's on the spine for the DM variant of the Just Jacket. Just kind of admiring some of these pencils, some of this artwork as I look through here. Hopefully you get a good idea as well, you know. With this book, you know, as with any other, it's always my main intention, or at least one of my main intentions, to make sure I'm properly showcasing it, giving anyone who's interested a proper look through. But this is the story, I'm sure, where you get Spider-Man, Claire, and Doctor Strange, and Satana. It is interesting to see, you know, when you read these comics from the time, how some of these horror characters were kind of intertwined into the Marvel universe. Yeah, you know, like as Dracula was introduced into it, and then Satana, Wendigo, all these other characters being brought into, you know, kind of, in many cases, they're sort of very old-fashioned characters being brought into what was then, at this point, you know, the modern world, with these modern characters. Still, most of them only recently created. I think more of the content in this book than the first book is some of the magazine content rather than comics. So Into the Hodiah Twist stuff now. Now, I haven't read the Hodiah Twist stuff at all yet, so I'll freely admit that. So can't really comment too much on that character. But here we go into the Lilith section, who again first appearing in the sort of Tomb of Dracula kind of story arc. There she is. Before she started to branch out a little bit, get utilised in her own stories. But throughout here, there are a few issues of Tomb of Dracula, or just excerpts of issues of Tomb of Dracula, which are all included that feature her. But yeah, you know, the more I look through here, the more I find myself enjoying the black and white magazine content, which is, you know, I only mention it because for me, generally, I'm not a huge fan of kind of black and white artwork, over-coloured artwork, but as I've taken the time to kind of deep dive into these books again in the last few days, to try and just familiarise myself with them a little bit again in preparation for these reviews, I found myself really, really enjoying it and just kind of staring at it and admiring it in a lot of cases. But yeah, I do need to kind of properly jump into this one and properly read it. But I tell you as well, as you see some of these Tomb of Dracula issues, like seeing this, for example, just really makes me want to see Tomb of Dracula get a second volume omnibus reprinted. Honestly, these Tomb of Dracula is so good, honestly. You know, if you haven't already heard my opinion on that when I covered that first omnibus volume of that series, then yeah, I absolutely love that series. Gene Colan's artwork throughout, just absolutely excellent. And seeing excerpts of it here, or full issues of it here, that would be in that second volume, just really makes me just want Marvel to hurry up and reprint that book. So yeah, I've seen some examples here of some of that quote-unquote explicit content, I think. Just some slight examples of nudity, of, you know, violence featuring vampires. Like, absolutely nothing that bothers me in any way, but I guess it might be a bit much for some people. This is one of the stories in which Storm had been targeted by Dracula in a previous issue of Uncanny X-Men, and then in this annual it kind of continued that story a little bit, and then Lilith, I think, got involved towards the end of it, hence why it's here. This one's an interesting one, this next character in here. So this is, I think, John Kowalski in a few issues of this series called War is Hell. And this kind of very much focuses on death, like literally death. You know, death is its own entity in the Marvel Universe. And yeah, so this guy's just kind of, I think he's just been kind of stalked by death, basically. Yeah, what I've really done with this book, I say, so I didn't read through all it. I read a little bit of each character, just kind of briefly sampled each one, with the exception of, I think, Satana's the one I've read pretty much all of. It's cool stuff though. Now, I'm a fan of the sort of Bronze Age comic style, so these sorts of 70s comics. generally speaking. Tend to find that I often enjoy these, the artwork of this kind of era. This is very much the sort of era when comics were starting to mature more so in the post comics, well, not post Silver Age world anyway, of comics. It's on to the Ulysses Bloodstone now, I think. A story in the Rampaging Hulk, which was a Hulk magazine. Don't really like this as much as some of the artwork previously. You know, the stuff in the Satana, the Lilith stories, I think, stronger than this. You know, I'll say a lot of the artists in here are not really creators that I'm personally that familiar with. You know, some of them I am, of course, but a lot of them have quite, to me, I think, quite obscure and not necessarily the biggest names, the most familiar names. Again, that's not a criticism. It doesn't mean, of course, that they're bad. Just that I can't make a whole lot of comments about them just because I don't know too much. Another example here, though, of one of those old school kind of horror stories, kind of monster stories. Like this is these one of the ones, I'm sure this is collected in the Stan Lee Jack Kirby Monsterbus, one of those books, featuring Grotu, King of the Insects. So this is very much kind of, I think it's late 50s, classic kind of Jack Kirby artwork. Back when these sorts of short monster stories, sci-fi stories were very popular. And this, right at the end of the book, the last issue, just the last few pages really, barely even counts as a section of the book in its own right, but this is the Manphibian, the one single soul Manphibian story that's collected in here. I think that's because this is the only issue that this monster creature ever featured in. And it's exactly what you might expect. It's a Manphibian, it's a creature from the Black Lagoon kind of thing. Features in this one pretty short story. And then it was gone. So, very cool in a way to have those kinds of very short-lived characters collected in books like this, just to prevent them from being completely forgotten. And then at the very back you get that In-Hyuk Lee cover again, which is just excellent. I love that. On the back of the book, just the same cover as on the direct market variant, minus the Marvel Horror text at the top. But yeah, so there we go. Another overview complete. Hopefully that one has been another interesting and insightful one. That's the main chunk of my Marvel horror books dealt with now, actually. I don't have a huge collection of horror books at this point in time. So now, as I say, just to recap, I've gone through Tomb of Dracula Omnibus Volume 1, Marvel Horror, and Marvel Horror Lives Again. I've got maybe a couple of other books that I might cover during this month, just to kind of throw in this Halloween theme I've kind of been doing. But other than that, I hope this has been of some interest, some use to anybody maybe interested in the book. Thanks for watching, guys, as always. I always appreciate you sticking with me through these things. And yeah, I'll be back again soon with another video. Thanks again.